I'll hear from Professor Logan from San Francisco State University. Professor Logan, for your 5-minute opening statement, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee. I'm Director of Labour and Employment Studies at San Francisco State University. I'm going to talk about the US experience with this type of legislation. I would like to mention I don't believe that the US is the centre of the universe. I was born in the UK. Before coming back to California, I taught at the London School of Economics in the Department of Management for 9 years. I did graduate work in Canada. But here I think the US experience is very instructive and gives rise to serious concerns about both the costs and the benefits of this type of legislation. I would like very briefly to make 3 points. I believe very strongly in union transparency and accountability, but what we have seen in the US, particularly under the last Bush administration that introduced the detailed financial reporting that this bill is based upon, was not real transparency. What it was an attempt to politicize regulatory enforcement in the name of transparency. Second, the costs of these new regulations, contrary to what has been stated before, for both government and for unions, I think there's absolutely incontrovertible evidence that the costs are very substantial, and I will come back to that point. And third and finally, I think there's no evidence whatsoever that these detailed financial statements have provided any useful service to ordinary union members. I think the only groups that have used them were the very groups that were pushing for them in the first place, and those have been groups that have a political agenda to weaken unions and to use this information, albeit often in a misleading and distorted way, against unions. So first of all, in terms of the attempt to politicize regulatory enforcement in the name of transparency, has been said about the Canadian legislation, there's absolutely no evidence that ordinary union members were pushing for these detailed financial disclosures in the United States. However, there's considerable evidence that unions with a separate political agenda to weaken unions were the very ones who were pushing for it. And I'll simply quote from one politician, Newt Gingrich, who I'm sure you're probably familiar with. He said that a future Republican administration must impose increased financial reporting requirements to weaken our opponents and encourage our allies. And that's exactly what the Bush administration did in the 2000s when it came to power. But the costs associated with these new reporting requirements are very substantial. The costs to the government are, in terms of processing these forms, are a minimum, and these figures are from the Federal Register, from the Department of Labour, a minimum of $6.5 million per year. And this is under a system in which we have had 60 years of experience of this. The Division of Department of Labour that does this has been established all of that time, and we know how to do these. And so if you're talking about establishing an entirely new division and training, using government resources to train unions how to comply with the reporting, there's reason to believe that it will be significantly more than that. In the United States, we have about 29,000 labour organizations that file these reports. They only apply to private sector unions, not to wholly public sector organizations, as I believe is the case in Canada. And importantly, the major cost is the filing of the so-called LM2 forms, which require the itemized expenditures of $5,000 or more. In the US, these apply only to labor organizations with revenues over $250,000 per year. We have much, much simpler forms for smaller organizations. There's a separate form for organizations with revenues between $10,000 and $250,000 $250,000 a year. There's a separate form for organizations with under $10,000 a year. And so this is not the case in Canada. In Canada, everyone will be submitting the more detailed forms, and this is what incurs the costs both to government and to the unions. The costs to the unions themselves are very, very substantial. Again, from the Department of Labour, it estimated the costs of complying with the LM2 forms, which are the types that are under consideration with this bill, to be $116 million in the first year, $83 million in the second year, $82 in the third year, and so on. And we also have now a very extensive academic survey conducted by scholars at Cornell University and at Pennsylvania State University of over 100 national and international unions in the United States. I can, in my submitted comments, I'll summarize the findings, but simply one of the findings...
Professor Logan, sorry to interrupt. Could we just have you briefly
wrap up? One final thing. Yeah. Absolutely. 83% of unions reported that staff members were required to spend more time on compliance and less time on other duties. So in sum, I would say, when you ask who has benefited, well, more burdensome reporting requirements have not benefited the public interest. They have not exposed cases of corruption or made union officials more accountable to their members. They haven't advanced the cause of transparency, but they have wasted public money and they have politicized regulatory enforcement in the United States.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to answer in more detail about any of these issues.
Okay. Thank you for your...
First, if I could go to Mr. Logan. Mr. Logan, you're an expert on labor laws and labor transparency. And obviously, the rules have been in place for quite some time in the United States. And you had cited Cornell and Pennsylvania, the studies that were done through those credible institutions. If you could take about 2 minutes and maybe just continue on, sort of highlight some of that experience, what's deemed to be the essence of the effectiveness of this and who really benefits.
Right. So the study was a very large-scale study of union administrative practices in general, and as I said, one of the main findings with regard to reporting and disclosure was that overwhelmingly unions were spending more time on compliance and less time on other duties. That 38%, for example, had to significantly change their accounting practices, 29% had to hire external consultants to comply with the new requirements. 19% had to hire additional staff to comply with the new requirements. So the costs involved for these organizations is very substantial. And this, keep in mind, was simply the costs of compliance with the new Bush regulations that were introduced only for organizations with revenues above $250,000 a year, but they would apply to all Canadian or labour organisations regardless of the level of their revenues. And this is time and money that's being paid for by ordinary union members. As I said, there was never any evidence presented that union members were pushing for this in the first place, and there's never been any evidence to demonstrate that they've received any benefit whatsoever from it afterwards. We do know something about what union members want from their unions. The Harvard economist Richard Freeman has written a very good book called What Workers Want, and they want information in very broad terms. They want to know, the union has more money coming in than it has going out. They want to know broadly where it comes from and where it goes to. But these types of revisions that were instituted during the Bush administration and which are now being proposed in Canada does not provide them with the kind of information that they want. It's not in a useful form, and there's never been any evidence that it's actually been used by ordinary union members in the United States. However, as I said, there's very substantial evidence that it's been used by organizations who have an agenda, who want to weaken unions politically and in other ways. One of the organizations that's used this information most in the United States is an organization called the Center for Union Facts, which is a right-wing organization that lobbies against unions in general and has an agenda to try to undermine unions politically in other ways.
Mr. Logan, I just wanted to, you've identified a couple of times that it was a previous administration in the United States who passed the legislation. You're not from the U.S., but you're working there. You'd obviously understand that there were two other levels of government, namely the House and the Senate, that would need to have passed those as well. And as I understand it, the timing of this bill was actually passed while the Democrats actually held the House and the Senate. So I would submit that it was the entire government that passed it, not just the presidential administration.
Mr. Logan, do you want to comment very briefly on that, please?
I will comment very briefly. You're absolutely right. It was passed at a time where union corruption and union racketeering was much greater concern in the U.S. than it is today. But even at that time, one of the chief architects of the law, professor of law at Harvard University, Archibald Cox, actually warned against, and I'll quote here, excessively elaborate reports which place an undue burden upon the ordinary men and women who serve as officers of many local unions. One aim of the legislation is to give publicity to financial malpractice. There could be no better place to hide than under a mountain of thousands of lengthy reports filed in the cellars of the Department of Labor. And so the intention of the original bill was never to impose this degree of reporting and burdensome administrative practices simply as a way of hobbling unions' effectiveness.
Okay. Sorry.
So just for my benefit, I would like to first ask Mr. Logan, since 1959, when the U.S. legislation was passed, and it was passed on a bipartisan basis, it was introduced by a Republican and Democratic senators. Has there been any amendments to the 59 legislation to date?
Well, what normally happens and what happens during the Bush administration to bring in new regulations that the Canadian bill is largely based on.
Mr. Logan, I need to know if there were any changes to the 59 legislation.
There have not been significant changes in the legislation that affect union reporting, but the process can be changed significally through changes in the regulation. It doesn't require legislation; it requires action by the Department of Labor.
Thank you.
So it was misleading to say there are no changes to the legislation.
Okay. Question now for Mr. Logan. If Mr. Logan hears me? Yes. Perfect. Earlier, you mentioned a number, what it cost the American government, $6.5 million to manage all of the data, the information provided by union organizations. And my understanding was that we're talking about the same relative number of organizations that would be required here in Canada to fill out these forms. And the requirements will be much higher than those of the U.S. Might we think that it'll cost the government something equivalent to $6.5 million, Revenue Canada?
Yes, in addition to that, in Canada, you have the costs of establishing this division in the first place, an entirely new complex layer of government bureaucracy. You have the costs of training union officers who are completely unfamiliar with these forms, whereas in the U.S. we've had many decades of experience with similar forms. And in addition, as I said before, the forms that the Canadian bill is based on are the most complex ones in the United States that only apply to organizations with revenues of over $250,000 per year. For smaller organizations, we have much simpler forms, but under this bill, you do not have that. Everyone fills in the same one. Your bill also covers public unions as well as private unions. Public unions are excluded in the U.S. And so all of these suggest that the cost in Canada will be very substantial indeed to the government, both at the national level and at the regional level as well. And certainly when the Bush administration introduced these new, more complicated forms with the $5,000 requirement in 2003, it claimed at that time that the costs were going to be very slight, but it's turned out for both government and for unions, and in both cases it's turned out to be untrue. And we have information from the Department of Labour in the Federal Register and academic studies that demonstrate what they said about the costs have not proven to be accurate.
Okay.